Hello, everyone. Welcome to our second part in our three-part series, Beyond the Rhymes.
We're going to go beyond the nuts and bolts of storytime delivery. As much as we love talking about the songs and the rhymes and the finger plays and the felt boards that we all use at Storytime, this series of webinars is actually focusing on the strategic decisions that librarians and supervisors can make together to achieve the largest success.
So to give you a little background on the two of us, my name is Heidi Dollamore. I am the Deputy Director at Solano County Library. I've worked with Patrick for several years where we developed a pretty robust storytime program.
My name is Patrick Reamer. I currently work at the Pleasant Hill Library in Contra Costa County Library, where Heidi and I work together to more than double our Storytime offerings and boost attendance by over 700%. We're really excited to share stories and strategies that worked for us, and hopefully you can apply them at the libraries you're at to make a bigger difference.
So, as we mentioned, this Storytime webinar series is in three parts. Last week, we talked a little bit about the people involved in Storytimes, and if you missed that session, the archive is available. Next week, we will be focusing on the package, how to package your offerings and make it simple and easy for parents to participate in Storytimes. This week, we are focusing on environments, both inside and outside of the library, where Storytimes take place.
So we're going to start it off by talking about getting out in the open. Storytimes are absolutely central to our mission in libraries, and so we need to think about where we can centrally locate those storytimes. We need to celebrate our storytimes. This is a really, really magical service that we offer. We want to make sure that it's out in the open where people can see it. The more that your storytime is visible, the more welcoming it becomes, and the easier it is for you to reach larger audiences with your early literacy services.
I want to underscore that this is a role that the community expects us to fulfill. They want to see libraries involved in early literacy services. In our last webinar, we mentioned a Pew report that points to 80% of the public wanting libraries to provide early literacy services. That same report tells us that the public isn't aware of many of the services that we offer. So we need to let them see us doing what we do. We need to let them see us doing story time. We need to make it as prominent and visible as possible. This is one step in raising awareness about what we do to support early childhood literacy and to raise the profile of early childhood literacy services.
Yeah, being out there in the open is just, it's like putting an invitation out to say, come and join us, come and watch us. It's sometimes not just the families that come and see us doing it. It's just casual visitors to our libraries who come and enjoy it, and they I get comments all the time from grandparents or seniors that don't have young kids in their lives who say, oh, it's just so much fun to see you doing it. So it's, again, just to piggyback on what Heidi's saying, it's so important for everybody to see it, not just the families that you're trying to reach with your story times. But let's talk a little bit about where you're doing your story time, because every library is a little bit different. You're going to have different options at different locations, right? Some of you may do your story times right in the children's area. You may have a little nook in the story time in your children's area. Other folks may have large meeting rooms, designated programming spaces that are separated from your children's area. But let's think about those spaces critically and figure out what's really the best place for our story times. Those meeting rooms or those programming rooms may be really nice in that they can accommodate large crowds, but maybe they're a little closed off, right? There's probably a door, maybe it's on another side of the library or even another floor of your library building. And that, in a way, hides this service that we're trying to make as visible as possible. So be aware of that. If you are doing your story time in a closed meeting room, what are you trading away when you do that? The other thing is, if your story time is kind of tucked away in a spot, would a walk-in know that the story time is happening? Do you have to be one of those parents who's in the know, right? Who's watching your online calendar or has got a flyer in hand and knows your story time schedule? We want to make it as casual as possible so that a family that just shows up to check out books and sees a story time will be able to jump right in. And that wouldn't happen if your story time was tucked away in a meeting room on another side of the building. So visibility is definitely going to be the best way to promote it. It's going to, word will spread, of course, as the more casual visitors are able to get, looped into Storytime. It's also some of those folks who aren't dialed into your website or other sort of promotional pipelines that you have. Some of these folks, these are the folks who really, really need it the most. They may not have other kinds of literacy support in their life, in their family, and so being able to make it open to those folks who don't have it scheduled and maybe don't have a Storytime habit, that's really, really critical. So yeah, putting it out in the open, I think word will spread. We certainly saw that at Pleasant Hill. And if you do have to put your Storytime in a closed space, think about leaving the door open or leaving out other visual cues to help people find that space, even if they weren't coming for Storytime explicitly.
Yeah, we want you to encourage you to think about your space, not just the objects in your space, but how do people move throughout and around your space. So are there other visual cues to let you know that Storytime happening if it's not immediately visible and apparent? I know that at our libraries we have a Pause to Read program, and we have these little laminated paw prints with Velcro on one side that we stick to the carpet to help direct people to where the event is happening, if it's tucked away in a corner of the library. Is there some other way that you can signal right as soon as people walk in the door, Storytime is happening right here, right now, and we are inviting you to join in?
I mean, no signal is going to be as good as the signal of singing children and parents, right? I mean, having it right up front and center is absolutely the best way to send that signal. But sometimes we need to, be flexible given the spaces that we have. Sometimes we have to live with those limitations.
So one thing that we want to do to make this series really practical for all of you is to give you some tips and tricks, simple things that you can go home and do right away in order to help build your capacity, help you explore and investigate how you're approaching story times. And so after each concept, we're going to introduce some takeaways, one geared towards supervisors and one geared towards librarians and other staff who may be directly providing story times. So we're going to start with a tip for supervisors. Conduct a physical audit of the layout of your children's area. Look for those visual and spatial clues. What signals to you that you are now entering the children's area of the library? Spend some time observing people and observing traffic patterns. And remember that those traffic patterns may be different at different times of day. Another thing that is very important to remember when you are conducting an audit, especially of the children's area, is that as an adult you may have an eagle-eye view of the space. And so, imagine what that space looks like if you're only 2 feet tall. It's going to be a very different way of perceiving the space, and something that might look to be a short shelf that you can peek over, all of a sudden becomes this giant wall that's a barrier to moving through the space.
Yeah. So the takeaway for librarians is to do the same audit separately. Look for those physical cues that signal, how to use that space, how that space is intended to be used. And then do it separately and compare notes with your supervisor and see what commonalities and differences. I feel like this is a really great exercise to jumpstart some conversation about changes that you can make to that physical space to make it more accommodating for families and kids of all different heights. And then, even think about comparing those notes with another branch, right? Have another location, another site in your library system, and see, what are some trends that are occurring, system-wide.
It's good to look for those things that are universal, but also those things that make your space unique. Many library systems encourage a unique or a consistent look and feel for their libraries. So do you have a standard signal that tells you that you're entering the children's area? If you're a solo library, you might look at a neighboring library. Even though you may think of yourself as a solo library, you may have community members who will be going from one library to another, and so they will be getting lots of different cues, lots of different signals from their different libraries as to what constitutes a children's area. Okay, so we have also built in a brief Q&A section for each of our concepts. So we encourage you to ask us questions. We're happy to respond to any of those issues and concerns that you're facing. And I know that you're also very capable of responding to questions from one another. There's a very lively chat stream during our last webinar, and we hope to see that today as well.
It looks like somebody chatted in, Tracy was wondering if we do registration at our story times. And that's actually a really, really important topic that we're going to be talking about at length in the third webinar, but I think we can say a few things about it now. We do not do registration for story times at the location I'm at. It's really, really important to us that we do not set up any kind of a barrier that would prevent those families that would just wander into the story time and jump right in from participating. Now, again, some people have incredibly small, cramped spaces, and that that puts limitations on what you can accomplish in that space. We're going to talk a little bit more about using those spaces, or maybe trying to find new spaces if the spaces that you have can't accommodate the demand that you have. Registration is often like a sort of like a Band-Aid that we put on the problem of overwhelming demand. But there's other ways to look at it, namely that it's not a problem, that it's a really great thing, but we just need to find the right solution so that we can accommodate those crowds that are coming in and give them a really high-quality experience, right? If everyone's packed in, it can be really stressful. You definitely want to avoid those kinds of story times where it's just a mob. But at the same time, there are some things that we can do, some strategic decisions that we can make that will allow us to accommodate all those folks that want to come in without using registration.
And to put things in perspective, Patrick, I think you mentioned to me last week that you just had a record attendance at Storytime of 264 people, and that was done without pre-registration. So obviously there are different strategies for addressing attendance of that size, but there are strategies, and so you don't need to feel as though you have to turn to pre-registration. There are many other strategies out there.
So this is Suzanne, and I was going to chime in because Rick sort of posted a comment and didn't phrase it as a question, but I actually think you guys might want to discuss it briefly. He was saying, while you're auditing the space where you want to have your story time, he's suggesting that you pay attention to the space and how it works for kids with sensory issues. And I'm wondering if you want to speak to that, especially when you're doing it out in the open.
I think that anytime that we try to improve our spaces to address the needs of a particular segment of our audience, the result is that we end up improving the space for the entirety of our audience. Things that improve accessibility, things that make the library's programs and services more user-friendly, for one, often translate into greater ease of use for people who you didn't necessarily have in mind when you implemented that change.
Yeah, I totally agree. I mean, it's sort of that paradox as you hear about folks that do an inclusive story time, but it's actually an exclusive story time. It's it's a story time that's just for a particular a group of families that have a particular need. But truly, all of our story time should be inclusive, right? And it is just a matter of making sure that we have everybody in mind when we put together our story times, when we do organize our space.
Fantastic. Okay, we've got another question here from Letitia. Do you do critical literacy types of story times to open up story time discussions about social justice issues with school-aged children? I wonder if story time spaces would be good spaces for doing this type of discussion.
That's fascinating. I love that idea.
I think that is a little bit beyond the scope of what we were intending to explore in today's webinar, but I'd be really curious to hear from those of you who are attending if you have anything to contribute on this. And we will review the chat transcript after the webinar is archived.
Yeah, we definitely are focusing on the 0 to 5, the preschool age kids and below. But I think that story time, we think we've said this before, story time is not just a program for 0 to 5. It's a really amazing program that can reach all generations, and it's such a flexible format. I feel like, no matter what changes we see in our communities, 100 years from now, libraries will still be doing some form of story time, right? We couldn't have anticipated the way that new technologies and tablets and all that kind of stuff would have affected story times, but it's such a flexible format that indeed we can reach all different kinds of audiences and connect with people in all different kinds of ways using Storytime. So I'm excited to hear more about that. That sounds like a really fun kind of Storytime.
And I just want to highlight something that's showing up here in the chat stream from Kathleen. She mentions that all of our story times are open to all ages, and when you don't have enough room for everyone, that's probably a good indicator that you may need to offer additional story time hours. Absolutely.
Yeah.
I heartily agree. Here's another question. What are your ideas for seating options, especially when chairs and mats are limited and space is limited, yet you may have different ages, toddlers, infants, adults at any one Storytime event?
Yeah, so we definitely encountered this. When I took over the Storytimes at Pleasant Hill, we had those carpets, and it became instantly evident that that was putting a cap on the number of people who could have a designated seat. We got rid of those, and though we do have chairs that are available for parents or grandparents or other caregivers who would be more comfortable, we're very careful to have a dialogue with those families as they come in to make sure that when they are seated, that they're not closing off the space, that it doesn't limit additional attendance. But it's true, we do need to offer some options because there are folks that do have needs and do require a chair, or parents who do feel more comfortable with a baby to be seated in the lap while they're in a chair. So we want to give them those options, but we do want to make sure that whatever their choice is, it's not going to preclude other people from coming into that Storytime space.
We mentioned, too, in the last webinar how important it is to have someone other than the Storytime provider there as people are arriving to help direct traffic. And it's amazing how differently the Storytime can play out if you have someone who can just gently guide people as they're sitting down, as they're staking out their spot for Storytime, help guide them so that you are using your space to the greatest effect so that you're not limiting your capacity. Simply asking people to, if they're sitting in chairs, making sure that those chairs are lined up on the perimeter so that there's plenty of open space in the middle of the area for those who'd like to sit on the floor, and helping to create pathways so that if you do have a circle of chairs around the edge, that you make sure that there's a path to enter and a path to exit, which makes sense both just logistically and from a safety point of view.
No, absolutely. I think we'll talk a little bit more about it later, but having that, not just a path to enter, but a path to exit is really important because we want to let families regulate their own Storytime experience, right? If a toddler is getting anxious and really needs to move around, we got to make sure that they have a way to get out and get free, right? It can be very stressful for parents who've got a kid that's just losing it or needs to be changed or whatever it is, and they're trapped in there. So definitely thinking about those safety issues and the convenience issues of getting in and out of Storytime.
Here's one more question, and then we'll move on to our next topic. Vicki says, how do you feel about grandparents taking up a space that could be used for children when you are limited in space and would otherwise have to turn people away?
That's tricky. So the way I'm interpreting the question is you have maybe a room that has a certain capacity, and the question is, should I let the grandparent come in with maybe the other caregiver, another parent, instead of allowing another child or another family member? And I feel like, again, that's not a place where we want to find ourselves, where we're forced making that decision. It's a dilemma between two bad choices. You're still limited in your capacity to provide story time. It looks like if you really are facing that situation, you need more story times or you need a different space entirely. I don't know, Heidi, do you want to chime in on that?
I agree. I think part of what we want to get at in this series of webinars is not just to answer your questions, but to probe you about the kinds of questions that you're asking and encourage you to ask different questions so that you can end up with different answers. And with that said, that's a nice little segue into our next section where we want to talk about goals and successes. Growing and improving any aspect of your story time requires thoughtful planning. Think about all of the time and energy and satisfaction that you get from learning new finger plays, developing your felt boards. This activity requires time and energy. And I want to ask you, do you put that same energy into other aspects of planning for your story times? A key to successful planning is goal setting. Goals help you evaluate whether you achieved what you set out to do. They help you anticipate and be prepared for those eventualities that pop up. Goals also give you freedom, and this is where I really relish in having clear goals, because there are lots of different ways to achieve the same result. And this is, yet again, another way that children's services staff and supervisors can work together, work in partnership. When you have a clear understanding of the goal that you're setting out to achieve, where you have complete alignment on that factor, you can also then, as a supervisor, step back and let your youth services staff spread their wings and figure out their own solutions to those challenges. You also give them permission to let go of things that are not helping them move towards their goal. And this is really important. We all have very limited time and resources. Even in the most well-funded of libraries, we're faced with making choices. Anytime that you choose to pursue one activity, you are necessarily choosing not to pursue another activity.
I think that's really important from my perspective as a librarian, is that a lot of times there are sort of legacy traditions with story time, right? Like there's a craft after story time. And maybe it's been that way for a long time at my library, and I feel like obligated to do that. But it's really important to question, well, if I have over 200 people on story time, is that really the best way to allocate our resources? I mean, can we really sustain that with 5 story times a week and hundreds of people coming in? So I couldn't agree with you more. I feel like those goals give us freedom, and it allows me to drop those things that are really just stressors and take me away from the central focus. What's the bullseye? The bullseye is connecting with as many families as possible through story time and developing those early literacy skills. Now, crafts are absolutely a way to support learning, but I think it's important to sort of uncouple those things, right, and say, well, can we do crafts in a particular format or in a particular venue or around a certain program, but is it really something that I can sustain at my location, day after day, week after week, given the resources?
Absolutely. So this is a little-known secret that Ranganathan's 6th law of library science is a goal for every program. I think it's so important to have goals. This is a word that you will hear me saying over and over and over again. And I want us to think about how we approach goal setting. It's easy for us to fall into a pattern as we become more familiar with our communities, as we become more skilled in our work, as we become more knowledgeable about our library and its processes. I think that we often fall into a pattern of doing the good work of librarians, anticipating the needs of our community, but we take that to a point where we anticipate the needs as we're developing our programs, and then we identify the goal after the fact. I want to turn that process on its head and ensure that we start with the goal and then develop the program to reflect it. This may take you outside of your comfort zone. You may see that your community is calling for something that you don't have as much experience in, or that you haven't tried before. And so you may not be guaranteed a success right out of the gate. And that's okay, because in the long run, starting with the goal, really developing your programs to reflect those goals and those community needs, that's going to give you the bigger win in the end. And there are many different ways to approach goals. You can think about goals in short-term chunks, or you can think about them in long-term phases. So start by asking yourself, what's a realistic goal to set for yourself with regards to story time for a 3-month range? And then think about, what's a realistic 6-month goal? What's a realistic 1-year goal? And you can even take it further than that. You can think about a pie-in-the-sky goal. What would be your ideal goal 10 years from now? Maybe it would be 100% literacy, and we've eliminated poverty, and we've, everyone graduates from high school. These may sound like fanciful goals, but they are, I think it gives us something to aspire to. And so it's important to have not just those achievable goals, those milestones that help you know that you're moving forward with your work, but also those stretch goals that encourage you to think differently about what you're doing. You know, if you approach a goal and say, I want to increase my storytime attendance by 5%, what might happen is you think, okay, I just need to run a little faster, work a little harder, do a little bit more of everything that I'm doing right now in order to get that 5% improvement. What if you reframe that and said, I want to double attendance at my story time? Well, all of a sudden, you realize that you can't do things the way that you have been doing them all along. You need to think about doing things differently. And so maybe that means taking story time outside of the library into an untraditional venue. Maybe that means approaching it from positioning yourself at the top of a pyramid where you don't have to reach everyone, but you can reach people who can then in turn reach more people, so that you're really making the most use of your time and your resources. It's so important, too, after you set those goals, after you work towards them and make progress towards them, to reflect on those goals. It's easy to cut out that step at the end where you make time to revisit and reflect on your goals. Ask yourself, did you achieve what you set out to do? Were there any surprises? And what worked and what didn't work?
And oftentimes that's the phase, too, when you realize maybe your initial goal wasn't quite right, and it's time to sort of massage that initial goal. Now that you have a better sense of what is doable, or maybe new opportunities that were out there that you didn't even consider, you can revisit and reframe those goals, too.
Absolutely. Some of the things to take into account when you're framing those goals is consider the size and the characteristics of your service population. How does this inform your goals? How does this shape the direction that you need to take with your programs? Here in California, we have over 3 million children under the age of 6. This is a huge population for us to reach. We need to be strategic in order to reach as many of them as we can. Ask yourself questions along the lines of, are you reaching half of your potential audience, or what percentage are you reaching? Are you reaching more than half, less than half? It becomes more tangible when you have the real numbers to look at. If you can think about it and say to yourself, okay, there are 1,000 children in my service population that are in this target age that we are looking to reach with story times. How many of them are we reaching, and how many more could we be reaching? Once you get those specific numbers, it turns from something that might seem unsurmountable into, okay, we just need to break that down into pieces. We can do that.
Yeah, and this is where the webinar is entitled, the place, and we're talking about environments, and we do talk a lot about the physical environment of your library building, but really, when you're talking about the larger environment, this is what we're talking about, right? All those kids that are out there that you're reaching, not just the ones who are already showing up at Storytime, already checking out books. Being able to, step back and zoom out and look at what the actual places that you're serving.
Exactly. How can you think about those goals to address different aspects of your population? Maybe a goal would be to reach more people, but a parallel goal could also be to reach new or different segments of that population. So if you can bring more people into the fold, that doesn't necessarily always translate to more attendance, but maybe it translates into a greater diversity in the kinds of people who are participating in your story times.
Absolutely. I think success is going to look different for different libraries. So that's our question to you: is what does success look like for you? Maybe it's these monster libraries. Maybe it's this targeted outreach. But what you need to do is look at your attendance patterns and get a sense of what kinds of messages are in there. Kind of tease out what is the attendance suggesting to you and your staff. Like I said, some story times are big and crowded. In some communities, there's no story time habit at all. So what are your opportunities? Are they best going to be inside the library, or are they going to be outside of the library? We talked a little bit about outreach before, and there was actually some really fruitful dialogue in the chat window talking about how some people just do tremendous amounts of story time, and they have designated staff to do outreach story times. And then there are other folks who are saying, oh, my supervisor doesn't even let me out of the building to do it. So that's really where I can't emphasize enough that it can't come from just one or the other. These are conversations that have to be had with lots of people at the table, but definitely a supervisor and a storytime practitioner at least, hashing it out and referring to some of these hard facts. Who is showing up at storytime? Where are they? If they're not in your building, how are we going to get to them? So maybe they're in a Head Start or a daycare. Maybe they're in a public space like a mall or a farmer's market. There's lots of different places that you could go to reach those audiences if they're not coming to you.
So as a supervisor, when I start thinking about outreach, it immediately for me becomes a scheduling and a staffing issue. But we need to make outreach a priority. We need to build in space in order for people to leave the building. Build it into your schedule, just make it a given, and then reevaluate everything that you're doing so that you create space, you create time, you create opportunities for staff to get out of the building. It's going to look different for different libraries, as it always does. Different strategies will be sustainable depending on the size of your library, depending on how many staff you have. Maybe a picture of sustainable outreach for you looks like one outreach activity per month. For some of you, it might be one per week. If you have a dedicated outreach staff member, I would expect it to be one outreach activity, perhaps even per day. Think about what is right for you, and make sure that you build that into your schedule.
I want to say too, when at Pleasant Hill, we had, rising attendance at our story times, but that didn't preclude the need for us to actually go out and do the outreach. There's so many advantages to doing the outreach anyway, even if you do have really robust story times at your location. I find that I'm a much better storyteller now because when you're out there in the wild and there's less that you can control, it makes you think on your feet. And I've come to some some interesting realizations just being out there on somebody else's turf and working with folks who haven't been habituated to sort of the rhythm of story time and how a story time goes down in a library. It's a totally fresh start, and that forces you to think about story time a little bit differently. So I found a tremendous benefit in getting out there. And then, of course, you're also roping in folks who will then show up at your story times in the library. Lots of times you connect with families out there, and you see them at your story time later on. So, okay, so let's talk about embracing success, because there are, I can tell listening to the chat over here, lots of folks do have large crowds showing up at their story times, and that can be a challenge for us. But I can't emphasize enough that demand is a good thing. We really need to celebrate that and support that and not limit that, because it's very easy for those folks who are doing story times to get overwhelmed, like, holy smokes, how am I going to maintain a quality story time when you've got all these people in there? And that again, it's going to challenge us to look at things differently and try new experimental approaches to doing story time. But we need to focus on expanding the capacity rather than limiting the capacity to exclude people, to keep those numbers down. So larger open spaces can help with crowds. But again, the best space may not be your children's area. There's an impulse to contain the story times right when they get big, but the more open we can keep it, and that includes passing on pre-registration. I really do feel strongly about it, and again, we'll talk more about it in the third webinar, but pre-registration can really destroy storytime experience for a lot of families who can't, they can't stay on top of it, and they're just going to be left out.
Patrick mentioned a philosophy of experimentation. This is so critical to really anything that we do in libraries. We have to acknowledge that our communities are constantly evolving, thus we need to be constantly evolving alongside them. We need to adapt to how our community is using our services. And I want to remind you that when you change your physical environment, people will use it differently. I can point to the example of interstates in the United States in the 1950s. Here was a grand plan to expand our capacity, to change our physical environment. And then there was a great plan for what it was going to look like once we built those interstates. As soon as they were there, the people using them had a totally different idea about what role they would play, how they would use them. And the same pattern of usage will translate into your library when you make changes to the physical environment. We need to break those changes down into small pieces, make iterative changes so that we can observe how each change affects those patterns of use. Try something out, observe it, and then try something else. Big changes start with lots of little changes. One example that I can point to was at Pleasant Hill when we started to see more attendance at our story times, and we needed to figure out a way to increase our physical capacity for attendance. Over the course of about a year, we actually removed 1/3 of our picture book shelving, which if you had said that to us at the outset, just take out this huge bay of shelves, I think that we would have all freaked out and not even been able to conceive of how that is possible. But we gradually made changes, slowly removing one small section of shelving and then yet another small section of shelving, and making room for those books elsewhere, moving other things around in the space. And now looking back, we can't imagine having that furniture there in the first place.
It's so constraining now that I think back to it. I can't imagine that we all packed in there. It's silly.
But what was also really interesting was the changes that we observed. Some of them were very unexpected. After we removed the last piece of the shelving, people didn't spill out into this new space that we had created because there was this mental barrier. Part of the floor was carpeted and part of the floor was linoleum. And so when people would come to story time, they would limit themselves by staying on the carpeted areas. And so we ended up getting a rug to extend the carpeted area. And the instant we did that, story time spilled out and took up a whole new space. And that's not something that we could have predicted until we saw it happen. So moving into our takeaways for this section, I want to encourage you, and again, each of these takeaways, these are, the supervisor takeaway is relevant and can be fruitful for librarians, and the librarian takeaway can be relevant and fruitful for supervisors as well. Think about looking at your census data. The American Fact Finder now has much more granular data than was available in previous years, and it's also updated much more frequently. You can get information down to a single year of age so that you can know not just how many children age 0 to 5 or age 0 to 6 are in your service area, but how many 1-year-olds are there, how many 2-year-olds are there. You can also identify how many families with children under 5 are living in poverty. How many of these families speak another language at home? And what percentage of children in your community are living with their grandparents?
I think the follow-up question there is then, once you've pinpointed some of that information, how well do your storytime attendees reflect that demographic reality? But for librarians, the takeaway is to identify a new venue outside your library. You may get out of the library a ton, or you may not have any flexibility to get out of your library right now. But think about what's that sort of that new space that you could try out Storytime that would really capture a new audience or reach a new, just a new group who probably have no idea that you have such great story times at your library. I think we mentioned a few of them, daycares and Head Starts and things like that, but there's, most cities have other kinds of events that happen throughout the year, like fairs or festivals. We do them at an art and wine festival. We do them at, there was a garden, a yearly garden sale, and we did a story time in a garden. There's just all kinds of opportunities popping up. It doesn't hurt to just shoot an email and say, hey, can we come out and do a story time for the kids that are there? I'm sure you guys probably have some other great recommendations. I'd love to see you chat in with sites that you've visited that may be kind of unusual for story times, but that worked for you.
I want to highlight one question from the chat. Tracy is asking, how are you defining outreach? I think that there are, in my mind, there are two components to outreach. One is going somewhere that maybe you wouldn't expect to find a library, somewhere that is outside of your normal environs, your physical building, anywhere outside of the space that is defined as the library. But the second piece of outreach is building relationships. That's ultimately what we're hoping to do when we go out and conduct outreach, not just a relationship with the early literacy, but a relationship with the library, and even a relationship with the people who work at the library, because we are the best ambassadors of what the library has to offer.
I think that actually that answers another question that came in here, which was talking about, I do outreach at Head Starts and preschools, but I still feel like we're not connecting with some groups that could really benefit from story time. And the question was, do you have any other ideas on how to get a hold of them? And I feel, again, that relationships is kind of the answer there, which is, who is serving them, if anyone at all, and trying to connect with the people who maybe understand that community a little bit better, to know where they're at and, what are they doing on the weekends and where are they going to be? And hopefully that can guide some decision-making around where you can position yourself to do story time. Okay, so we're going to go on and talk about playful spaces. Story time is really an elaborate kind of play, and so we want to think about the physical space where your story time is going on as supporting play. And that's not just the 20 or 30 minutes where you're actually doing the story time. Story time really extends beyond that, right? It floods into those minutes before you start the story time, and also sometimes hours after story time. As we all know, families love to hang out and have little play dates. So thinking about how we can create a space that's going to foster free, social, playful learning. So here's a little quote from Vygotsky, who was one of the first researchers to really recognize the power and the importance of play for all of us, but especially for young ones. I think most of us adults have that division in our mind, right? The division between work and play as being somehow opposites to each other. Maybe less so in libraries, I'm glad to say, but still, it's hard for us to get over this notion that play is purposeful, that play is the work of a child. And I think you see that in these really terrible stereotypes of libraries as being these super quiet, studious places, as if, silent reading is purposeful, but somehow, running around and doing some noisy puppet show is not purposeful labor for a child. So, children are they're born to play, they're born to learn through play, and we need to support that in whichever way we can. So, so let's talk a little bit more about learning through play. There's a ton of research out there, and that demonstrates, the value of play as a means for learning. Psychologist Peter Gray, who's written a lot and assembled a lot of existing research about play, talks about it as not just a behavior, but an attitude. So it's not just the stacking up of blocks, right? But the frame of mind of a child who's engaging in constructing something. He's actually got a really great book out called Free to Learn, where he talks about a lot of these issues. But I'm just gonna start talking about some of the characteristics that he's pointed out, characteristics of play. And you think about your library space and your story time that takes place in that location, and kind of just do a little checklist and see how well it's measuring up in terms of facilitating play. So one of the first characteristics he points out is that play is self-chosen and self-directed. So what that says to me is that we need to give children as many options and as much freedom as possible for them to pursue play in their own way. So, and that means even right in the middle of story time. And I think we talked about this in the first webinar about the sage on the stage or the guide on the side, and that the greater role that kids have in determining the course of a story time, the more successful your story time will be. And that also goes for giving them the freedom to leave story time when they're done, when they're tapped out. And we'll talk a little bit about that later on, some strategies to facilitate freedom around story time.
And children who are playing in story time are going to excite and engage other children in your story time. Remember that you, as much as we would like to think it, we are not the focus of story time. The children are the focus of story time. And so if they are paying attention to you, great. But if they're paying attention to each other, even better. This is an opportunity for them to learn from their peers. This is an opportunity for them to feel engaged.
Yeah, the kid who comes up and starts pawing at your felt board can be really frustrating if you've got a master plan for story time. But the reality is that kid is just excited to be there and excited to play. So, so here's a couple other characteristics to take in mind. That means are more valuable than ends when it comes to play. We need to trust in the process of story time, right? There's tons of research to show the kinds of early literacy activities that we're doing in story time are going to build lifelong learners and lifelong readers. But we can't approach story time like that's the one and only goal. You see these preschools that say it's like university preschool or whatever, send your kid to this preschool so they'll get into the college of their choice and then become a doctor or a lawyer. That's exactly the kind of goal setting that's going to screw up your story time and derail sort of the joy of what's actually happening. We talk about structure and rules with story time. With play, the structure or the rules need to come from the players to allow them to play on their own terms. This sort of ties back to the self-directed and self-chosen activities. But it's very common, I think, for us to set up lots of rules around story times. You have to show up at a certain time, or you have to get a ticket. You have to write your name on a badge, sit a certain way, be quiet a certain way. That kind of structure can be really stifling for play. And so we need to think about, what are the rules that are necessary to make sure that everybody has a really quality experience at story time? What's some rules that are necessary to keep things safe? But what can we strip away to allow as much freedom as possible for them to play on their own terms? There's also the characteristic of non-literal or fanciful play. We often think that story time is a great way to expose a child to the real world, right? The connecting learning to things that are in their life. That's absolutely really important. By all means, do that fire engine song. Because those fire engines are obviously a really cool part of their real world. But so much of the really fanciful, imaginative play is not tied to reality, and we need to celebrate that just as much. The last characteristic I want to point out about play that Peter Gray discusses is active and an alert mindset, but a mindset that's not stressed. So for us, that means calibrating stimulation in our storytime spaces. Again, if you've got over 200 people at a story time, that can be incredibly stressful. So we need to figure out ways to manage those crowds and engage them in a way where people aren't stressed out, but they're just really engaged and active and alert.
And I think a lot of these concepts, like many early literacy concepts, are things that translate to us as adults. So to give you a framework to think about that, we often talk about this kind of a state for adults as flow, when you're in that zone where you're really focused and you're just being so either productive or you're so engaged. This is what flow looks like for children. Flow for children may look a little bit crazier than flow for adults, but it's the same concept. They are just really, really into what they're doing. So, to get back to spaces, I'd like to tell you a little bit of a story about a space at the Pleasant Hill Library. This is what came to be known as our Storytime Auxiliary. And this space started out with a $1,000 community grant. I don't want that to feel, for some of you that might feel like not a lot of money, for some of you that might feel like a lot of money. I want you to feel like that is an amount of money that is very much within your reach, even if it's not within the grasp of your budget. It's out there, and it can be found through those relationships that you may be building through your outreach activities. So we got $1,000 and purchased this play equipment. I think that the cube was about $500. The rug was a pretty large rug, and it was a couple $100. Then you see some large stuffed animals that were maybe $75 or $100 each, and the boy who is leaping onto the line is actually on a whale-shaped chair-like object that cost maybe about $200. This space was intended as a stay and play, a place that families could gather after story time, but what surprised us was how it was used during story time. It became a pressure release valve for those children and those families that just felt a little bit squirrely. They needed to move, they needed to be active, but they didn't want to disengage from story time. This was a way for them to participate in story time in a different way on their own terms. These are families that might have otherwise left, they might have otherwise gone home and not stayed, but because we had an alternative space for them, an alternative way for them to engage, they stayed. And you would often see children playing with the wire maze, very focused on the wire maze, and then you'd see them look up and sing a verse of the song, and then go back to the wire maze as though nothing had ever happened. We often see them, too, running back to get their sticker or their hand stamp at the end of story time. They felt like they had participated, and so they wanted that acknowledgement at the end of story time. They recognized that they had participated in story time, even if they hadn't sat in the story time circle, even if they hadn't sung any of the story time songs. This area was directly adjacent to the space in which we had story time. There were no doors to go through. There were no bookshelves to walk around. There was a free flow between these two spaces.
Right. So let's be a little realistic, because we're talking about celebrating play and allowing for that, and with that comes noise. And this is a big issue for a lot of libraries. I feel like sometimes we don't make decisions that are child-centered because we are so concerned about noise. And wherever there's play, there's going to be noise. And some visitors are definitely coming to your library to seek quietude, to seek that quiet study space. But these are shared public spaces. Our libraries are shared public spaces, and there are going to be different desired uses for that same space. So what we need to do to manage that is to communicate what our expectations are. Certainly designating quiet spaces, for those folks who are coming in and may not be familiar with the different areas in your library, direct them to spaces where they can get that quietude, especially when there's high traffic from kids and families. Or if your library is small and you don't have a separate spot for quiet study, you can have conversations with them about, what are some quieter times of day. We can help manage those expectations through dialogue with our patrons who really do need that quietude, and let them know that, in the mornings at 11 o'clock every day of the week, we're going to have a story time, and it's probably going to be a little bit noisy. Or after school when the teens come in, right? There's only so much that we can do to mitigate the volume there, but it's so important that those people are using the library. So again, I feel like one of the best ways to handle noise is to manage expectations around noise and around specific spaces in your library.
So I want to get back to these objects that we can place in our spaces to help facilitate a playful environment. We don't have to have a lot of fancy toys in order to inspire this kind of plays, but these objects do act as catalysts, and they can be a signal to people who are entering your space, an invitation to engage in play. They invite different types of use than a chair or a bookshelf. If you have a giant stuffed bear, or if you have a crazy wire maze, you're going to observe different behavior than if you have a bench or a couch. And this is an opportunity for us to create unique and memorable experiences in the library. I want to encourage you to think beyond the kinds of toys that you might commonly see in a private home. This is a place where we can give our community a different kind of experience. Much in the same way that with our collections, we're able to give people an experience that they wouldn't be able to recreate with their own wallet in their own home. Think about objects that can accommodate several children playing at once. Mm-hmm. Thinking back to that cube with the wire maze, you could have 4 or more children piled on and each interacting with that toy without having to feel like they're fighting for space. They're able to share that and play together. Also, think about these as social objects, just like story times are a venue not just to develop early literacy skills, but they're a venue to develop social skills. It's a place where kids can interact with one another. Mm-hmm. These playful objects can serve that same purpose. They can help to build those social relationships and those social skills, which are going to serve them so well throughout their entire lives.
Sometimes I think the social interaction is just as valuable as the designated early literacy activities that we've got going on in Storytime. I mean, there's so much growth that happens before and after Storytime. I think we deserve to give ourselves a little credit for that too, setting up an environment where this is going to happen even without us. That's to be commended.
Absolutely. I think we've all observed friendships develop in our story times, whether it's friendships between children. Some of those friendships may last as long as story time lasts, and then they walk out the door and they have new friends. But some of those friendships really develop and grow into something special. You can also think about the friendships that may develop amongst your caregivers. For some parents, this may be a rare opportunity for them to connect with other adults out in the world, and so that can be a special role for us to play as well. These toys that you see in the auxiliary, the Storytime auxiliary photo, like I said, these were all in the $500 or less range, any one item. This is a reasonable amount for you to go out and ask your community to contribute if this is not something that you can make space for in your budget. This is something that is a perfect match for a request to a Rotary or a service club like Kiwanis. They are going to enjoy this kind of a donation as well because these are durable items. These are things that will live and last over a period of years, and so they can feel like something that they've contributed to the library is able to take on a life of its own and is able to reach not just one family or 100 families, but maybe many, many families over the years.
It can be even more visible and sort of quantifiable than a bunch of books, right? Oftentimes we ask for donations for books, but this is something that's even more visible than that even.
So our final set of takeaways for today, for supervisors, I want to encourage you to talk about noise at a staff meeting. It's so important to develop a consistent understanding and expectation around noise amongst your staff. One of the most confusing messages that we can give to our public is to be inconsistent, whether that's inconsistent in how we are enforcing behavior expectations or inconsistent in how we're communicating what to expect when you come to visit the library. Many of our takeaways are suggestions for discussions or for staff meeting topics. These staff meetings are such an important venue for establishing a shared sense of purpose. This is a way that you can help invite everyone into the joy that is Storytime. This is an amazing and wonderful program that everyone in your library should feel that they get to take credit for, regardless of their position, regardless of whether or not they're the one performing the Storytime and for the children.
So for our takeaway for librarians, try to find two improvements, one that's under $100 and one that's under $500 to make your space more playful, and talk about it with your supervisor. Again, this really is a very low bar, and it's amazing what something very small, even just $100 can do to transform a space. Maybe you're going to fund it with we had at Pleasant Hill, we had an elementary school student who did a fundraiser at their school just to purchase new seating in our kids and teen area, and that was extraordinary. There's so much interest out there to see these places come alive that it really is doable, very doable.
So for our last Q&A, I want to call out a question that came up a little while ago from Tracy. She asked, how do you engage an audience with a 1 to 200 ratio?
Yeah, for me, music is really critical for keeping it all together. When you have that many folks, a lot of times people think of that as being a huge burden or challenge when you have that many folks, but there are actually advantages to having bigger story times, and I think it's very evident when you do a very musical story time. When everybody is singing along, there's a sense of unity that you don't get when you have a kind of a small or intimate story time where maybe not everybody knows the words or maybe not everybody feels comfortable with their singing voice. But when you have a big crowd, everybody feels comfortable singing because they say, heck, nobody's going to hear me anyway, right? And that's true for me too. My confidence is actually increased when I've got a bigger story time because they're carrying me. It's not just me trying to do a performance or something. That's not what story time is. We want everybody engaged, and having those larger crowds actually can be a boon to getting that engagement.
And we'll be talking more about that topic at our third webinar next Thursday. So I hope that you have have enjoyed this. We encourage you, if you didn't view the first webinar, to go back and view the archive. We've built on the topics that we explored in the first section, and we hope that you'll join us for further exploration in the third and final part of our series, where we talk about customer service and the whole package of Storytime. And we do invite you to contact us. We both have put our emails up here and as well on the handout that is available on the InfoPeople website in connection with this series. The handout encapsulates all of our takeaways for all 3 webinars, as well as a suggested reading list. So thank you very much.
Thanks again, everyone.